Dr. Burrhus Frederic Skinner is generally recognized as one of the most creative and influential contributors in the history of psychology. After completing his PhD degree in psychology at Harvard University in 1931, he embarked on a highly productive research and teaching career which included posts at the University of Minnesota and Indiana University before returning to Harvard in 1948, where he is currently Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology. He has been the recipient of many distinguished academic awards. His publications over the years reflect an imaginative transition from basic laboratory research to a concern with the crucial problems of mankind. His attention to the problems inherent in education led to his development of the teaching machine. In addition to teaching machines, his novel Walden II has ingeniously brought his ideas to the attention of society at large. It was for us a rare privilege to conduct this extemporaneous interview in Professor Skinner's study in his Cambridge, Massachusetts home, the scene of much of his planning and writing.
First of all, Dr. Skinner, one of the, because I think that kind of is a kind of fundamental beginning point for a lot of our students as they study psychology, is the question of personality development or behavior development of the individual. And the kind of a model that has become very well known and probably increasingly well known to our students over the years has been the work of Sigmund Freud. And as you know, Freud in his basic theoretical formulations talked about the fact that during the first 5 years of life, certain patterns became very, very critical and pretty well integrated into the personality, and that perhaps later in life, the individual seemed to be living over these same patterns over and over again. And I wonder, how do you feel about this kind of model of behavior development?
Well, the Freudian mental apparatus doesn't make much sense to me. I think Freud made some very important contributions. As a determinist, he convinced a good many people that things which had been dismissed as accidents, caprice, slips, and so on, were actually lawful, and I think he was right on that. But he, unfortunately, had to fill in the gap between the events which he'd causally related, and he chose to do it by constructing or piecing together and modifying an elaborate conception of something going on inside the organism. This is particularly true in trying to relate the behavior of the adult to what happened to him as a child. Here are 25, 30, 40, 50 years which transpire with no evidence of a causal effect, and then suddenly something happens which looks as if it were related to something that happened when the individual was a child. Now, I'm convinced that there are connections of that kind. The child is influenced and changed as a biological entity. It happened to him. I don't think that the Freudian formulation represents what happened very well and doesn't permit you to trace it down and relate it to current behavior. I feel there's a great deal to be said for stating these things in terms of behavior rather than in terms of feelings and emotions and recollections and memories and whatnot. Those can be accounted for in terms of behavior if you want to do so. Certainly, they are not needed in accounting for the behavioral facts. I'm interested in the science of behavior, which is part of biology. It deals with observable events. And I think the Freudian apparatus and all of the things which the Freudians feel they observe in their own special way are fictions or metaphors. They're versions of some sort of primitive animism. No doubt about that in my mind.
Well, of course, this same kind of observation then would have certainly applied to the Freudian theory of the unconscious. Certainly, you wouldn't take this very seriously.
No, it doesn't make any difference to me whether things are conscious or unconscious. The causality in behavior depend upon awareness. Awareness is something superimposed upon it. We become aware of what we are doing and of why we are doing it because society insists that we talk about these things. Society says, why are you doing that? What are you going to do next? What do you think you're going to do? What are you planning to do? And the child learns to look around and find something to talk about in response to those questions. And in this way, he becomes a self-conscious person. It's a curious thing that it's society which makes the individual observe himself. He'd have no reason to do it otherwise. There's nothing in the non-social environment which would ever generate awareness. Now, what is awareness? Well, it's the same reaction to part of the environment as any behavior is. Just happens that the part of the environment in this case contains and includes activities in the organism itself.
Now, of course, another thing that Freud contributed as well, perhaps you might say he was by no means the only one, but he did contribute what became a kind of a model of motivation, kind of a homeostatic model, of course, borrowed from biology. And this has led, of course, to a kind of widely accepted view of motivation in our contemporary psychology. We find a very common definition of motivation being something like this: all conditions which arouse, direct, and sustain the organism. And I certainly know that you have a view of motivation that may not quite agree with this kind of homeostatic model, and certainly be interesting to hear how you'd react to this.
Yeah, there are two issues here. One concerns the dimensions of behavior itself. Now, by behavior, I mean the movement of an organism in space with respect to itself or any frame of reference you want to specify, or occasionally the products of that movement. As in the case of speech, we don't really observe the muscular patterns very closely. We can get along with the sound patterns. That's rather specific, and it's likely to cause trouble, so that people tend to fall back on a rather mushy description in terms of adjustment, adaptation, homeostatic development, and so on. These are ways of avoiding an explicit description of behavior, and I think they're dangerous for that reason. So on the one hand, if you are simply trying to account for the fact that this individual stays in balance, or that he does cope with a situation successfully, or that his condition improves over a period of time, you're not specifying any action when you say that. So that's not specific enough. On the other hand, what are the variables which lead an organism to adjust? If you want to specify the behavior more specifically, then you have to look for more specific causes. And it isn't enough to say, oh, there's a totality of conditions within the organism, and that must be what causes behavior. You want to find causes which are manipulable, independent variables that can be changed, and you can, if you find them, satisfy that you found them by manipulating them and seeing what happens. I would want to deal with the probability that a response will be made, or actually, since it's not possible to deal with probability as such, I'm interested in the rate with which a response is made, and I want to take that back as a function of manipulable, demonstrable conditions. Now, they're not always manipulable, and they're not always identifiable, and if they're not, then you're helpless. You can make a guess, but that's all you can do. But the field of motivation is not, I think, a very difficult one. If you have a situation in which you can observe the frequency with which an animal or a man engages in a given activity, then you can search for all of the variables of which that frequency is a function, and when you've found them, then you've given a complete account of it.
Of course, this motivational kind of homeostatic motivational model has given rise to kind of a nosological or classification approach to motives, sometimes describes a kind of a biocentric orientation, where many of our thinkers, writers in this field talk about certain primary drives or motives or needs. Various terms are used, and they describe these being part of the inherited nature of the organism and necessary for the maintenance of the organism, for example, hunger, thirst, and so on. Then they talk about a process where these are modified through the environment, through learning. And they talk about higher forms of motives, secondary motives, derived motives, tertiary motives, and so on. Just to be perhaps even a little bit more concrete, for example, Dr. McClellan suggests that a degree of early independence training in the child will be a factor in developing need for achievement, and that we have either high or low needs for achievements, and that even cultures can be studied in terms of their achievement levels. And then, in a sense, here we're trying to use this as a means of explaining behavior. Now, specifically reacting to this kind of work or research or thinking, you would again say that this is, again, bringing up a kind of a fuzzy aspect of the situation. It's not well enough defined to be meaningful.
Well, I think we can handle the facts perfectly well. I don't think that's a very good way to handle them.
I see.
I don't see any reason to postulate a need anywhere along the line. People often complain that in our experimental work we use hunger or thirst or sex or some very specific biological reinforcer, and then they raise the question about what about the non-biological reinforcers which don't appear to reduce needs. Well, food is not reinforcing because it reduces a need. There is a connection between food deprivation and the fact that food is reinforcing, which is to be sought back in the phylogenetic history of the species. It would be terrible if we were hungry all the time and would eat all the time with a high probability. That changes with a biological condition, but food is not reinforcing because it alters a condition of hunger in a physiological sense. And so far as I'm concerned, if you can show that a baby is reinforced by the sound made by a rattle, and rattles are based on that principle, that's just as useful as a reinforcer in accounting for behavior as the fact that the baby is reinforced by food in its mouth. But I don't worry about that. Now, on the achievement kind of thing, what these people seem to me to overlook is the extraordinary importance of the act of reinforcement. It isn't that you're just getting something. It's the question is what have you done at the moment you get it? I could make a pigeon a high achiever by reinforcing it on a certain schedule, and I can make a child a high achiever by reinforcing it on a given schedule. I can't do it by altering a needs. I don't know how to alter needs. There's no way in which you can put a key in a slot and twist a need in a person. What you can do is to make an individual hungrier, or you can use food skillfully so that it will work for food at a very high rate when it's hardly hungry at all. And that is the important thing. If you want people to be productive and active in various ways, look to the contingencies of reinforcement, not to what needs are being satisfied. Now, the need for achievement I take to be a conditioned reinforcer, to refer to a conditioned reinforcer, when, over a course of many years, moving nature about, producing changes in nature, particularly producing changes in the social environment, when over a period of time these have been followed by other already established reinforcers, then the mere manipulation becomes reinforcing.
I see. It would be kind of interesting to hear how you would regard within this framework of yours this term or construct emotion. Can you see some usefulness of this concept?
Not very much. An emotion, to me, is like a need. It refers to an imagined internal state which is supposed to account for behavior. Now, just as in the case of food and deprivation, you can find physiological processes, so in the case, let us say, of anger, in which it seems to be highly reinforcing to damage someone verbally or physically, you can find internal activities going on at the same time. I think the effort to define anger as a particular pattern of autonomic responses will never succeed, because these responses are common to a lot of other things, including many which we don't call emotional at all. The effect of violent exercise would look awfully emotional if you put it on a polygraph or something like that. The emotion, so far as I'm concerned, deals with changes in the probability of engaging in certain kinds of behavior defined by certain kinds of consequences. Anger is a heightened probability of attack. Fear is a heightened probability of running away. Love can be defined in the sense in which one person loves another as a heightened probability to do good to that person. And when two people are in love and are mutually doing good to each other, the thing builds up and can be very powerful. So that it's a very important theme in the analysis of human behavior.
Mm-hmm. A lot of our conceptualization, of course, some of the early work of Cannon, Bard, Carlson, others, have led to some formulations in recent years that have been tied in with the work of Hans Selye in his general adaptation syndrome, when he talks about a stressor setting off an alarm reaction which will lead to a stage of resistance and possibly exhaustion. And one kind of thought that has been particularly important in the area of medicine today has been this area of psychosomatic medicine, where they're kind of somehow saying when this autonomic discharge is blocked, this somehow acts back on the organism and can do bodily damage.
That just goes to show how, in the sad state in which physiology now finds itself, they ought to develop a methodological approach that will clear that sort of thing up. That's mostly nonsense. And insofar as behavior is concerned, we don't need it, and we're well advised to keep away from it. I fully anticipate that someday all that's going on inside the organism will be understood, and its relation to the response of the organism to its environment will then be clear. As an analyst of behavior, I want to relate probability of response to a large number of independent variables. and those variables are separated in time and space. Something must fill in the gap, and I'm looking forward to the time when the physiologist will have something to say about it. What I've always objected to is filling in the gap with speculative theories about what must be going on inside. The physiologists need, of course, to observe directly what they're talking about. And they are beginning to do that, and I think it's very promising, very hopeful signs. Unfortunately, most of the people who are most active in exploring the mediators of behavior seem to me not to be aware of progress in the analysis of behavior, and to be instead trying to explain somebody's fictional explanation of behavior. The notion of experience, I think, is we can get along without that perfectly well. And yet those who want to trace the stimulus through the body, so to speak, hope somewhere in the nervous system to find a copy of the external environment. We don't need the notion of a copy at all. I don't think there is any copy in the body. And the sooner those who want to trace the physiology realize that and stop looking for a copy, the more rapidly they'll get on.
Mm-hmm. Now, would this kind of observation apply also to some of the kinds of interesting developments in neurophysiology which have gone into the areas of, well, using varieties of brain stimulation techniques which have come up with some interesting new insights, for example, into the reticular formations and hypothalamic and thalamic activity and so on?
Well, these, again, are mainly concerned with what is going on inside. If it turns out to be the case that stimulation through carefully implanted electrodes becomes a common variable altering behavior, that must be taken into account. Same thing is true of work with drugs. Operant conditioning techniques are very widely used in assessing and exploring behavioral drugs. To this extent, they become, in a sense, new variables to be used in the analysis of behavior. But of course, they are much more interesting, I think, to the physiologist, and that's their main significance.
Mm-hmm. So apparently a very important point of distinction here is developing a kind of a fictional language almost, which in itself may obstruct clean understandings of behavior as against directly dealing with behavior. This is apparently a very fine point, or perhaps a rather important point that you're really making here with respect to a lot of this research in physiological activity.
Yes, I'm perfectly content to let the physiologists go along by themselves. I would like to help them if I can, and I strongly advise them to stop trying to account for psychological fictions and get down to demonstrated relationships between input and output and account for those.
Mm-hmm. Now, another area that's been rather classically examined in psychology, the area of perception, cognition. And of course, we do have a great deal of research constantly going on in this field. This is a field that suggests that we can either deal with very disciplined experience of the organism and analyze this. This goes back to our early work in sensation that your colleague Professor Boring was so important in developing, to our more recent approaches where we forget about the disciplined introspection and we want completely undisciplined introspection, phenomenology.
Well, I think the trend that you point out is due to the fact that what used to be thought of as an important branch of psychology, namely how the end organs work. This was important because the British empiricists thought that this was going to lead to an analysis of knowledge. This is now perfectly, obviously, a matter for physiology. How does the eye work? How does the ear work? And so on. But there remain those curious activities which are assigned to perception rather than sensation, where the end organs themselves don't seem to account for the transform between the physical environment and something inside. I think all of that work suffers from the notion that somehow or other one is indeed trying to relate experience to reality. And you will find that people will say in a distorted room, for example, you look in this way and that's the way it seems to be, and you look in sideways and that's the way it really is. Well, that's nonsense. They're both the way they seem to be, if you want to put it that way. The view that somehow or other we are analyzing experience and relating it to reality is, I think, what the field suffers from. I don't at the moment particularly care about objective experiments studied in this way, because I don't feel it one should answer the most difficult questions in a science first. The reason people study perception is that they're intrigued by perceptual phenomena. The Gestalt psychologists have been going now for what, 50 years on the strength of intriguing visual illusions. They've done nothing about them. They're no clearer today than they were in 1912, but there they are. A lot more have been added. And students get fascinated by this. Many people are drawn into the field only to find themselves 50 years later still barking up the same tree. There are things in any given field which are very subtle and should wait until we know more about them. And I would say some of the subtleties involved in perception are things that we can quite justly allow to rest until our analytical machinery is more accurate.
Some of us would say that perhaps your work in verbal behavior, studying verbal response, is a way perhaps of now, in somewhat more austere manner, getting at some of these things that we might call experiential or part of the private world of the individual. Would this be a fair description of the importance that you seem to be seeing in verbal behavior and verbal response?
Well, I think so. The linguists don't like my book because they themselves are not able to conceive of verbal behavior as behavior, partly because if they did, they wouldn't be able to handle it because they don't have techniques for studying behavior as such. But the analysis in my book, which deals with verbal behavior without appealing to a concept of meaning or any other mental concept of that kind, is, I think, a step in the direction I'm talking about. And a lot of behavioral phenomena, such as metaphor, for example, bear striking resemblances to perceptual problems. I'm not giving up on perception. In fact, I'll talk about perception to anyone who wants to talk about it. But I do feel that putting it so prominently at the forefront now is a mistake. I would say that in general, when one is studying a perceptual phenomenon, it is a question of exploring all of the different kinds of stimuli which lead to a common response. Two objects which are different but are judged alike, that is a good example of this. I see no reason why, if you want to do so, any problem in perception cannot be converted into an exploration of the range of stimuli which give equivalent responses. But it's always a response, not what you see. And this is what is missed in the physiological and psychological tracing of the stimulus through the body. Everyone seems to feel that somewhere, probably up in the brain, there must be a copy of nature, and the perception people seem to feel that they are exploring the ways in which that copy differs from reality. But I insist there's no copy there at all. That as soon as the organism begins to respond to the environment, it is responding and not duplicating, and that in seeing, let us say, a triangle, there need be nothing in the behavior which is triangular in any sense whatsoever, physiologically or behaviorally. A long time ago, in some experiments with pigeons, we were teaching pigeons to peck small triangles. And we made a carbon paper copy of where they would peck. And we gave them a big triangle, and they pecked in the corners. They saw the little triangle in the corners of the big triangle, this kind of thing. Well, of course, there's enough in common between the corner of a big triangle and a small triangle to control the directed response.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Skinner, as you talk here about the response as a means of getting at really the experience of the organism or perceptual aspects of the organism's behavior, it reminds us of some very interesting early work that was done by L.W. Max, in which he tried to do somewhat the same thing in a very elementary way, of course, when he tried to study actual muscle response during an ideational process in an organism, in an individual. And of course that is a kind of a beginning point for trying to get response aspects of experience. Now obviously your level of looking at response in this manner is far more complex and sophisticated.
Now you can, if you like, take the response of a small muscle group as a response and deal with it and make something contingent upon it. But the responses I deal with are the overt molecular actions, molar actions of the organism on the environment, and I define a response in terms of the effect on the environment.
Well, what about recordings of perceptual activity other than verbal responses or the kinds of general motor responses you described, such as that which we obtain from instrumentation? Of course, as you know, there's been some work with the EEG getting responses. Or do you think this would appear to be a fruitful means of getting at responses?
No, it may be possible to make some change in an EEG a response by making something contingent on it, but what is going on in the EEG pattern during behavior is again part of the physiologist story, and it adds nothing to the account that we want to give of behavior at the level of behavior.
Now, of course, another area of course, great interest to the psychologists, perhaps maybe central interest, is the area of learning. And of course, it is in this area which our own knowledge of the history of your own work, we know that this was the area that precipitated a good deal of your thinking and the kind of model you developed. Yeah. And there are some very interesting basic considerations that one might see that kind of sets off your model as against others that were developed. And a lot of this, of course, goes back, for example, to conditioning. And of course, we know the basic idea of Pavlovian classical conditioning must have been rather instrumental in some of your early thinking. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about how you felt that Pavlovian thought influenced you.
Well, I certainly took off from the notion of the reflex and the conditioned reflex in the early years of my work as a psychologist. But very shortly I realized that something was wrong with that. And before the publication of the behavior of organisms, while I still use the word reflex more freely then than I do now, the basic notion of an operant was quite different from a reflex and very different from the Pavlovian conditioned reflex. My thinking has changed even further on that now. I'm not at all sure how I would formulate the Pavlovian principle today. I think it was a curious accident, in one sense favorable, in one sense not, that he seized upon the salivary reflex. There are not very many responses which fit that paradigm. And there have many people have pointed out inconsistencies and difficulties in the Pavlovian analysis. It just doesn't happen to interest me at all, because I'm interested in behavior which does not begin as reflex at all, nor does it become reflex in Pavlov's sense.
Now, would you care to discuss the distinction between classical and instrumental as you see it, and then in terms how you would move from there to the kinds of things that you've been doing?
Well, I don't use the word instrumental. I don't think it's a very happy word. I don't think it involves instruments always by any means, and there are small units of behavior where the word is really not appropriate at all. I use the word operant in the sense of behavior which operates on the environment and produces reinforcing effects. You define an operant in terms of its effects and study it in terms of its effects, because it must affect your apparatus when you report the occurrence of a response. The pattern is very different. Operant behavior, as I see it, is simply a study of what used to be dealt with the concept of purpose. The purpose of an act is the consequence it is going to have. Actually, it's the consequences it has had in the past, and these are what we study in the case of operant conditioning. It's the changes in probability of response which are brought about when an act is followed by a particular kind of consequence. It can be positive or negative, reinforcement as the case may be, and the datum that you watch, the thing you follow, is the probability that a response of a given type will indeed occur. An operant is a class of responses. A response is a single instance of that class.
We also have another condition here that operates what we may call contiguity, which, of course, Professor Guthrie made so central to his particular thinking. How, first of all, would you see the importance of contiguity in this system, that these associated events must occur within a certain time interval?
Well, I don't believe that the Guthriean kind of contiguity is important. A contiguity of response and stimulus I'm not particularly interested in. I use the word contingencies to describe the conditions which prevail at any given time, relating a bit of behavior to its consequences. And the various kinds of complex equipment that we use in the laboratory are designed to arrange certain contingencies of reinforcement. That is, they arrange that when a response has a given topography, it will indeed be followed by a reinforcing event, or that it will be followed by such an event on a certain schedule, or that it will be followed by such an event only in the presence of a given stimulus, and so on. I view the study of operant behavior as essentially an exploration of the effects of all of the extremely complex contingencies of reinforcement that are around in daily life or can be created in the laboratory.
You did some work which raised some very serious questions about the value of punishment in the learning process. I wonder if you might give us your feelings about this.
You can distinguish in the first place between punishment, which is the presentation of an aversive event contingent upon a response, and negative reinforcement, which I would define as reinforcement through the elimination or removal of an aversive stimulus, conditioned or unconditioned. Now, the field of aversive control deals with generating behavior. When you say you punish a child to make him work, you're misusing the word. You are arranging some conditions which he can escape from by working. He escapes further punishment by working, but you use it to generate behavior. When you punish to keep the child from misbehaving, then you're trying to suppress behavior. And the early experiments I did suggested that punishment doesn't suppress, as it had been supposed to do. That while punishment is still being meted out, there may very well be a reduced tendency to respond, but as soon as punishment is withdrawn, the behavior will bounce back. Now, that isn't always the case. Extremely severe punishment may knock behavior out for good, at least for good so far as we can follow the course of the behavior. But it is surprising if you make punishing events contingent on behavior, how the behavior will recover and an organism will continue to behave even though rather severely punished in that sense. I object to aversive control in general because of the byproducts. All sorts of emotions are generated. Escape. If you use aversive control so that, let us say, a student studies to escape punishment, he'll start escaping in other ways. He'll play hooky, he'll be a truant, or he'll be a dropout, or something of that kind. Another common reaction is a sort of inaction, apathy. The individual just stubbornly does nothing. These are all inevitable byproducts of the use of aversive stimuli to control people. And positive reinforcement does not generate comparable byproducts, and that's why it's better. Now, if we knew as much about negative reinforcement as we do about positive, I suspect we would find that it can be rather effective in shaping behavior. At the moment, it doesn't happen to be. But still, the byproducts would be there, and I would still be, in general, against the use of aversive control.
Now, of course, it's kind of interesting that our entire culture, as of course I know you've also observed, is so much centered in its activities around aversive control, laws, regulations, rules, the whole grading system in colleges and universities, the even salary schedules are so often tied into aversive control, and so many of our things that happen, even varieties of group behavior seem to be, even informal situations seem to be centered around aversive control. We find some rather distressing things. Just to take education as an example, we have youngsters go to college for a year and they have certain achievement tests and they learn something, then we retest them a year later, they've forgotten a good deal of this information. Could this be partly accounted for in terms of the fact that so much of this learning is related to aversive controls?
Yes, I think forgetting is, in that case, one form of escape, and no one has ever figured out a way of preventing it.
And of course, we have a great deal of concern here about, quotes, morality in our culture. There are those that argue that we are living by one standards of values in terms of morality, and actually we we give lip service to still other standards. That
Yes, well, this is an issue that involves aversive control, because the notion of personal responsibility only makes sense under an aversive system. When you say an individual is responsible for his action, you mean simply that he can be justly punished when he fails to act. And if you turn to positive reinforcement, there's no comparable notion of responsibility at all. And yet, our whole system of law, religion, morality is in general based on punitive systems where the individual survives only by being responsible, by working his way out, by controlling himself in order to avoid punishment. If you then propose a different system in which people will naturally be good, it will be rejected because there's nothing comparable to moral struggle involved in it. This is the problem that I have in talking about the design of cultures in general. My critics complain that I am depriving man of the right to struggle, to reach a condition which the environment has reached more directly in another way.
There may be one thing, for example, building an entire culture out of a system of positive reinforcement, but then now bringing a system of positive reinforcement into a culture that already, operates around aversive controls is another matter. How can this be handled? I mean, is this a solvable problem? Can we slowly begin to shift from our aversive control to positive control in our culture?
Well, there are transitional problems always. If you can go from one system of control to another, you're usually in trouble. This is a question today of the delinquent who simply pleads that he's a crazy mixed-up kid and should be forgiven, it isn't his fault, and so on. If you are going to control delinquency simply by punishment, then you've got to stick to that, and the delinquent is guilty, he has been responsible, he's failed, and he must be punished. If you try to do anything else about it, there will be an interim transitional period in which your controls are likely to be rather bad, and that's the point at which the delinquent will choose your new formulation as an easy way of escaping punishment. You can't blame him for doing it. That's a predictable example of human behavior in itself.
Now, in this same paradigm here, of course, figuring rather prominently as an alternate for aversive control is extinction. That is, there are certain kinds of responses that we feel are undesirable, so we extinguish them. Now, exactly what do you mean by extinction in this framework, and how can what seems to be, at least superficially, a negative factor become, in a sense, a factor in shaping?
Well, I think that extinction is one way of getting rid of undesirable behavior. Just make sure that no reinforcing consequences are contingent on the behavior you want to get rid of. But it isn't a very effective way. It takes a long time. It's often hard to put up with the behavior while you're getting rid of it that way. I am much more inclined to make use of the reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Some very interesting work has been done recently in teaching discrimination without errors. And this seems to involve not only not needing to extinguish the wrong response, but actually using the right response as a way of reinforcing turning away from or ceasing from the wrong response. This, I think, is a very promising possibility. It's scarcely been developed at all because we're only beginning to explore the alternatives to punishment. It's too easy to punish if you're strong enough anyway. If you're bigger than the student, you can resort to punishment and get away with it.
Yes. Now, this whole question of positive reinforcement, and of course a good deal of your experimental work has demonstrated how powerful a tool it can be in affecting behavior. And of course I guess we could talk superficially at least about a schedule, 100% schedule reinforcement, that every time the individual does something that is a desired, makes a desired response, you reward them, the next time you reward them, and so on. And of course you have indicated that although this would seem to be very effective, it actually isn't.
No, it's very wasteful of reinforcers for one thing, but no, as you indicate, positive reinforcement is extremely powerful, and I don't know how to make that clear to anyone except to demonstrate it. I've never known anyone who has read up on this field who wasn't nevertheless almost stunned by
the pigeon as an experimental organism and demonstrating the unusual and complex repertoire of responses. This pigeon could be shaped into making through primarily positive reinforcement and schedules of positive reinforcement. But you know, there's always a great need in the culture to make inferences from this kind of thing, and of course one of the, I guess, very powerful influences that you've been very instrumental in making in this respect has been what we sometimes call teaching machines. And as a matter of fact, I might ask you, I don't know if you like this phrase teaching machines. It's been used and associated with your work so much. Do you prefer some other term rather than
No, I'm responsible for it. People advise me not to use it, but a sewing machine sews, a washing machine washes, and a teaching machine teaches.
Yeah.
The original teaching machines were actually the elaborate equipment in operant laboratories which arrange contingencies of reinforcement. And that's all teaching is, arranging contingencies which bring about changes in behavior that are wanted. It usually brings them about more rapidly than the natural contingencies in daily life. The teacher expedites learning by arranging as particularly effective contingencies. At least that's the theory. Now, the contingencies arranged by the teacher without instrumental aid are often quite defective. And I'm quite sure that today you can teach much more effectively with devices of one kind or another, and that in the future they will be a commonplace in all instructional situations.
Well, let's take a kind of a simple everyday example, say that a teacher in an elementary grade may have. Let's say she's a very competent teacher in the sense that she has organized material very, very well in a step-by-step sequence. Let's say that she's teaching mathematics, which has a kind of a hierarchical arrangement. Now, in the process of this, doing this job of teaching with certain skill, with a great deal of sophistication for a hierarchical arrangement and so on, is that in that normal setting, is this teacher inadvertently introducing some reinforcement schedules that you would say are reasonably adequate?
I wouldn't say they're reasonably adequate. Of course, if she's teaching at all, she's teaching because she's arranging reinforcing schedules. But it isn't just a question of breaking a subject down into a progressive series of steps. That isn't the whole thing.
Right. Now, this is, I think, a rather important point, because I think in trying to evaluate something of this sort, that this is one of the first things I think that strikes many observers, that the so-called program does do this. Now, there's, as you're saying, there's much more to this. Now, what other elements are there in this, then?
Well, in the first place, there is the progressive shaping of a complex response by beginning with very small components. This isn't just verbal behavior, although the verbal behavior is an example of it. I do this demonstration in my classes. You simply take a hungry pigeon with a food dispenser and ask the class what they want to see the pigeon do. And in a few minutes, usually no more than 2 or 3, I can have the pigeon pacing a figure 8 or bowing to the audience. And I do it simply by operating the food dispenser at the right time. Now, you can't wait for the pigeon to pace a figure 8 and then reinforce. You wait forever. You choose any response which is going to contribute to that figure 8, and you select them and build it up, and that is a kind of programming. Another kind of programming is where you bring the response under the control of a particular stimulus. So the pigeon does this only when the light is on, not when the light is off. You can program that very skillfully and save a lot of time by doing so. Another kind of programming is the scheduling business. If you devise a piece of apparatus which will reinforce every 100th response and put an organism in the presence of that apparatus, he'll die before he'll be fed, because he never will make 100 responses. But if you reinforce every response and every second and every 5th and every 10th, every 25th, every 50th, and every 100th, you can get a pigeon to go on indefinitely responding 100 times for a small amount of food. And actually, we've got this up to 1,000 or even 10,000 responses for a very small measure of food. Now, that takes programming. You could never reach that final stage without going through the intervening stages. What I object to in most learning studies is that organisms are plopped down into some terminal contingencies of reinforcement, and then they're allowed to struggle through. Perhaps they arrive with the right at the terminal behavior, perhaps they don't. We call it trial and error, and that doesn't really describe a process at all. It doesn't describe a behavioral process.
Yeah. Now, to get back perhaps again more concretely, now we have looked at the problem of the teacher, even skilled teacher organization, and you say there are some schedules in there or she wouldn't be really teaching at all. Now in contrast, then you carefully programming, you carefully program, let's say, this elementary mathematics, let's say. Now, what is the reinforcement for the child in this situation? It can be, of course, a token or a toy, superficially. Now, are there any other kinds of reinforcers possible here?
Oh, yes. The teacher doesn't have too much to use as a reinforcer. That's one of the tragedies of education. But there are things, these contrived reinforcers of prizes, tokens, pats on the back, approval, attention, and that kind of thing. And I think more important, some little indication that the child is progressing towards some ultimately desirable state, at least the state of having got through school and being free to go away from it. That's a possibility. But any little indication of progress, such as being right in a given problem, so that you can then be right on the next one more readily and so on, that's enough. As I say, I don't regard any reinforcers as biologically determined. Some of them have an obvious relevance to biological conditions, some don't. I think the human organism is in general reinforced simply by being effective. Now we may be, to some extent, the world today, it is undoubtedly reinforcing to the student to be right. Now, this may be because he's so seldom right, but supposing we have an ideal educational system, it may still be the case that you may have to bring in something a little more important than being right, but we have lots of things left over.
I think that's a very interesting point you're raising, the reinforcing aspect of being right. Now, the child has several choices, and when he makes the correct choice, aside from anything else, just the act that this is a correct choice allows him to go on. You wouldn't, therefore, describe this reinforcement as being something internal, as being self-satisfactory.
No, all reinforcers are defined by their effects. Now, this is not circular any more than that certain metals can be magnetized and others cannot. Until we knew more about molecular structure, you could only classify metals as magnetic or otherwise. Now we can classify events as reinforcing or otherwise with a particular organism, and some of them have a plausible bearing on the physiology, and some don't.
Now, what limits of complexity and material to be learned can be set on using programming technique? In other words, we obviously already see a great deal of application of this with fairly elementary material or things that would seem to very obviously fit into this kind of thing. For example, grammar, teaching foreign languages, teaching various symbols in the armed forces. But what about getting into so-called abstract areas of knowledge where, let's say, you're going to try to communicate a course in epistemology, philosophy? Well,
anything that can be verbalized can be programmed for a verbal type of machine. There are other much more important things can also be taught which are not verbal at all. But if you can verbalize epistemology, then you can teach it as such. I think it might be embarrassing to put down the right answers in your program in that field. I'm sure there are any right answers.
You're aware, of course, of the fact that many critics of this programming approach would argue that you are losing something that's happening besides that which can be reduced to verbal response, something internal, something broader, something more subtle. Something
what you're losing is a student does get something out of a bad teacher. He discovers how to learn in spite of a bad teacher. And obviously a good teacher lacks. And it's quite true that in learning a programmed course, the student will not be doing some of the things he does in trying to learn something in a badly taught course. But those things can be taught separately. You teach them how to study, how to think, and so on. I don't see any point in making education chaotic and difficult in order to teach the student to rise above a difficult environment. If you want to teach him to rise above a difficult environment, then program a difficult environment.
Well, as I look over here on your desk, I notice that you're beginning to map out some basis for a book in the future, and it's kind of orderly and very well thought through here, and I know that until very recently you've done teaching. Do you apply some of these principles to your own teaching?
Oh yes, contrary to what many critics have said, I regard myself simply as an organism which responds to its environment, and this is my environment, and it's designed precisely to bring out my behavior with maximal efficiency.
Dr. Skinner, now I know that there has been some work going on in which there have been some attempts to set up schedules of reinforcement with patients to the point where they can, within the hospital setting, gradually be trained to function and become more responsible for themselves and so on. How do you regard this effort?
A psychotic patient is psychotic because of his behavior. You don't institutionalize a person because of his feelings. Now you can say, oh, but his behavior is a result of intense feelings of some kind, but the feelings must be the result of something, and when you look into that, you find that they are the result of environmental factors, or I don't rule out the possibility of genuine illness, which is certainly going to be internal, but the illness in that sense is not the rich experience which I'm accused of leaving out. I see nothing demeaning, nothing undignified or ignoble about building a world in which a psychotic person can adjust. I am convinced that many psychotics are certainly sick or damaged organisms, and I don't believe that they can be returned to the ordinary environment successfully. But they can be brought under the control of simplified environments, and their lives will be, I think, happier and possibly more productive when that is done. There are two possibilities. One is to eliminate the poor contingencies which now prevail in those institutions, where in general the troublemaker is reinforced by getting the attention of attendants and whatnot. And the other is to be much more explicit about it and build a world which is contrived, admittedly contrived. It's not a natural environment, but these are not natural cases, in which such people will live reasonably effectively from day to day with a minimum of care and hence under better conditions. Because when you have to keep people in order and clean and so on against their own contributing negligence and whatnot, it's expensive and everyone suffers and not a great deal of money available for the care of psychotics. But if you could reorganize their environment so that their behaviors are more effective without the intervention, constant intervention of attendants, then you could give them a better life with available facilities. That, in my way of thinking, it increases their dignity and nobility. It's true that they're being controlled in a rather artificial way, but if the life they then lead is reasonably adequate, I regard that as a success.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, apropos of our discussion of application of schedules of reinforcement to shaping behavior and fairly with respect to certain applied situations, another area that, of course, I understand some of this has been going on has been with the mentally retarded. I know we're very concerned about this, and do you feel somewhat the same way about this area, too, that this is a fruitful approach?
We've done some experiments with institutionalized retardates, IQs of 50 or something of that sort, whatever that means, and they can respond to, again, a stabilized, simplified environment, and I'm sure that institutions could be reorganized along these lines. At the present time, they tend to be controlled through subtle aversive techniques, even though the attendants may be full of goodwill. No one benefits from that. I believe that the institutionalized retarded just below the level at which he can be returned to the world could probably be placed in an environment in which he would not only live reasonably happily all day long, but would be productive. These people are capable of performing certain kinds of work and actually making a living so that they could live under happier circumstances for which they are actually paying.
What you're really saying, then, is some of our conceptions of retardation have suggested that people are less trainable than they really are.
Oh, no doubt at all about that. And this has been true of all organisms. I know psychologists who tried to work with pigeons in the old days and who couldn't get them to do anything. Now, in the last 20 years, pigeons have done things which no pigeon has ever done before. It isn't the pigeons have been improved, but the contingencies under which they live have been improved. And the retardate doesn't measure up to the normal environment and can't get along in it, but he is capable of perfectly acceptable behavior in an environment which has been designed for him.
Perhaps one of the most interesting and at once controversial novels we've had in recent history, certainly written by a psychologist, is your novel Walden 2. And certainly some people have say that you're discussing here a utopia. Some people have argued that you're doing something here that is quite, well, what shall we say, rather distressing to the humanist,
yes,
and so on. And I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about Walden 2. That is, essentially, what are you talking about here? What kind of society are you trying to describe here?
Well, I wrote the book quite seriously. It's not a dystopia, it is a utopia. I thought it was possible at the time I wrote, and I think it is so today, for a group of people, well-meaning people, to get together and organize their lives by cutting down some of the things they normally consume, to cut down in turn the aversive labors required of them, to organize their social environment in such a way that they make more contacts of a satisfactory nature, to organize a school system in which children are educated for the life they're going to lead, organize the economic system so that if you do have to work, you at least work under pleasant conditions, and so on. I think that could be done. I think it's quite a feasible possibility. And I described this in my book. But the reaction to it was violent. Life magazine called it such a triumph of mort main, or the dead hand, as had not been envisaged since the days of Sparta. Joseph Wood Crouch not only wrote half a book attacking Walden 2, but has returned to the attack on many occasions. And I've asked myself, what this is all about, what's eating these people? Why is this life so horrible? And apparently the only point is that it has been planned by someone. If Joseph Wood Crouch climbed up on a mesa down in New Mexico, where he now lives one of these days, and came across a small civilization living the life described in Walden 2, I'm sure that he would come down out of the hills saying, "What fools we are, here's the perfect life." Until someone said to him, "But there was an old Indian named Fraser who designed this world," and that would kill it all. The fact that this is not the product of a series of accidents in a cultural evolution, but is design, means that someone is in the position of a designer, therefore is in a position of a threatening despot. Now, I don't think that's true at all. I think there are kinds of guarantees against despotism. If there either are such guarantees, or we're without hope.
Now that's a very interesting point there. Guarantees against despotism here, in terms of this being, in a sense, a concern about any planner. Here we have a planner, Fraser, Dr. B.F. Skinner, talking about a society here in which presumably you're trying to create a climate of positive reinforcement, reward, eliminating punishment, one where man will be able to rise to his most comfortable level of functioning and productivity and so on. And to some degree, we have here some goals that seem to be quite congruent with what philosophers might call the good life, really. On the other hand, we have planning going on in so-called dictatorial countries, which perhaps some of these planners also think that they're talking about a good life. Now, where is the guarantee here that one is not despotic and the other is?
Well, this is the old question of value judgments. What values are used to judge one society as good and one as bad? There is, first of all, a question of the techniques. If you govern by threat of coercive action, as the Nazis did, waking people up in the middle of the night with a knock on the door by the Gestapo, you can control, the government can control for a long period of time, but it is governing a group of frightened people. Moreover, it doesn't encourage support from outside, and eventually it fails. Now, I think the Russians are trying to avoid that kind of control. They've had a history of a good deal of it, but they are trying to use positive reinforcement, but they're not organizing the contingencies properly. They're giving things away which should be worked for, and I don't think that the present system shows that they understand this problem properly, that the people controlled are working at less than their maximal capacity. If you have to control through superstition and ignorance, as was the case in India some time past, control is very profound. The Maharaja and his descendants prevailed for centuries, but they're governing millions of ignorant people, and it isn't a strong state. But in the long run, you have to look to the question of the survival of the group, and a despot who controls through the use of techniques which weaken the group eventually weakens himself. Now, I don't know whether a man will arise, as Fraser is said to have arisen, and realize that his own power depended entirely upon the strength of the people. As a matter of fact, the book is written in such a way that Fraser is not currently ruling at all. He has no control. Yeah. People don't know who he is, and he can't even ask someone to come around and talk to his friends. They go off swimming, and so he has no current control, but you can say, but at least he did put the whole thing in motion. But he didn't do it for his own aggrandizement, and if he had done it for that, it would have failed. He has successfully suppressed himself as a figure. That was deliberately written into the book, and I think it's a very important point.
Have you yourself seen some evidence in cultural anthropological data that shows that there are some subcultures that in the world right now that begin to approach what you're talking about in Walden 2?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't believe nature ever performs an experiment the right way. And although you might find a group in New Mexico or the South Seas where there seemed to be very little competition, for example, you can't argue from that the happiness of the group is attributable to the lack of competition, because a great many other things are peculiar to those cultures. So that isn't the way to prove it. You can't prove it by give an example. I should be very surprised to find a thoroughgoing culture based on positive reinforcement come about through accident, because too many things favor aversive control. It's immediate, powerful, and the subtleties of positive reinforcement can only be discovered, I'm convinced, through an experimental science and extrapolation of such a science to the design of culture.
Now, admittedly, your research and extensive data that you have shows how powerful positive reinforcement can be, and yet, through the evolution of cultures, we find, almost without exception, as you're suggesting, cultures that are operating out of aversive control. Why somehow has this occurred? Perhaps that may be too difficult to...
No, I don't think so at all. I think aversive techniques are immediate. They work when you have one person stronger than another, and that has been the pattern. The bully dominates the coward. The power ruler, especially who can organize henchmen to exert power and so on, dominates all of the citizenry and so on. This is an easy thing to account for because the results are immediate. The results of positive reinforcement are very often deferred, and it's very hard. It's the same thing is true in education. The teacher who wants a student to be quiet and study can threaten him and get that result. But, of course, the student only studies under that pressure, and once you release it, he will never study again. But if you can induce him to study for other reasons, which is much more difficult and requires a much better understanding of human behavior, you have a permanent result, because you'll be using consequences which will continue in his life as he goes on in the world.
Yes. On the other hand, though, if we can go back to, say, a pre-literate society and examine what's happening, and as you say, certainly studies of leadership in pre-literate societies certainly show that dominance and physical dominance seems to be the most important factor.
Yes, and that's followed by trickery as a rule.
Yes.
The first hero is the power man, the Beowulf. And then there's the tricky kind, the Brer Rabbit, who puts it over Brer Wolf and Brer Bear by violating all of the codes of the group. He cheats and lies and so on. Almost all cultures have a cheating hero at some stage. But eventually you get control for the good of the controllee, and that eventually builds a powerful group. It doesn't build a powerful ruler, but it builds a powerful unit as a whole. The other systems build powerful rulers, but without the support of a group under them.
Would you hazard an estimate here that inadvertently some of our theological teachings may have reinforced the conception of aversive control?
Our theological teaching, did you say? Well, religions, I think, have moved toward a positive kind of thing, controlled through love and goodwill, but they certainly begin with jealous gods and punitive conditions of all kinds. I think there's been a change in religion, as there has been in government and economics.
It's kind of interesting that so often the whole notion here of aversive control is taken so much for granted that it just seems to be taken for granted, and there's very little question.
Practically all of government, of course, is based on it.
That's
when you try something else, there was a very interesting experiment in New Haven once where instead of giving people tickets for going through stop streets, they had someone around taking numbers for those who stopped, and they sent them postcards saying you were observed to come to a dead stop on such and such a day. Congratulations. Well, now that will probably actually increase the number of dead stops. It will not, of course, control the real lawbreaker. But that is so unfamiliar that you laugh, and people laugh when you describe that case. It just doesn't seem appropriate to a government to operate through positive reinforcement.
That's right. In a sense, we've looked at several applied areas here, and there's one we have not yet talked about in any great detail, at least, and this is the work that I know that it's in the mill, as far as you're concerned, and this has to do with this whole question of technology of education. Perhaps maybe I might start out with a kind of specific question. Would you feel that our present educational systems are operating as effectively as they could?
No, they certainly are not. I would defend them. I think educators have done a very good job given the resources at their disposal and the attitude of the public toward them. But they can do very much more, and they can only do it if they fully understand the learning process and the teaching process. The teaching machines are only one aspect of a technology of teaching. I'm doing a book on that subject, and it will not be about teaching machines any more than first years in my book on schedules was about the equipment that we used to arrange schedules. Devices of all kinds will certainly be utilized for very good reasons. One is to get away from this aversive control. Our pattern is still highly aversive. There was an article in the paper this morning that teachers in New York are no longer going to be allowed to assign homework at home as punishment. Now, this means that work is punishment. And you'll find teachers who will excuse students from schoolwork as a reward. This is just the wrong way around. It ought to be, additional homework ought to be rewarding, and if you want to punish someone, you should deprive him of an opportunity to study. But this is as unthinkable as using positive reinforcement to control traffic violations. Now, we're committed to a punitive system, and we have all of the byproducts in dropouts, truants, vandalism, and so on. But to change that means that you've got to arrange much better schedules of reinforcement than a teacher can possibly do working with a large group of students. If you have an individual tutor for each student, it's conceivable that these methods could be appropriately employed. But if you don't, you have got to work out some other ways in which the student will be reinforced appropriately in shaping his behavior progressively toward the goals of education. In other words, the technology of teaching will emphasize individual instruction. Now that educators pay lip service to individuality, but our practices are as regimented as they can possibly be. In New York State, the Board of Regents tells exactly what each student should be studying at a certain year in grade school and high school. Nothing could be more regimented than that, except that we know they aren't going to learn it, so we aren't worried about it. But the only reason we aren't worried is that the thing is so weak. If you had an education that really taught these things, then you'd have to scrap that syllabus right away, because this would be serious regimentation. But to allow the individual to follow his own bent, working at his own speed, so the good student can move quickly, the slow student who is not necessarily unintelligent can work at his own pace effectively. This is all quite feasible with instrumentation and with a basic analysis. We now teach subject matters: geography, arithmetic, spelling, grammar, and so on. These are repertoires of responses. What we indirectly teach are what we call various abilities, ways of thinking, ways of solving problems. Those can, I think, be attacked directly and taught much more effectively, and I predict that the curriculum of the future will be more directly concerned with the various behavioral capacities, and it will be with subject matters. It's much more important to teach clear thinking, how to memorize, how to think in 3 dimensions, than it is to teach geography, mathematics, and so on, although indirectly they are learned when you study subject matters. And if it is a special skill in how to learn, how to memorize, then it could be taught by itself, regardless of subject matter, and then you turn the student over to subjects and he can get them quickly. But I'm much more concerned also with the traits, so-called personality traits of the student, particularly his interest in what he's doing, his perseverance, sticking to something, courage to stick to an unpleasant task, the enjoyment of literature. It's very difficult under the present system for someone interested in literature to teach a student to continue to read and enjoy what he reads. And here you find that the wrong contingencies are at work. Most schools are very proud of what their students are reading. They like to say, oh, well, but in the 10th grade we read Dostoevsky. Well, we do, probably, but how many students never read again because of it is a question, and it's a very serious question. The scheduling of reading materials which will build further reinforcement so that the student becomes hooked forever. He's hooked on literature now. He will go on reading, and he will go on reading more and more difficult things. This is what should be taught. You shouldn't teach As You Like It and David Copperfield and a list of books. You should teach a love of reading, because knowing the contents of Ivanhoe, that's trivial. But having got a great bang out of reading it, or another book, is something else, because that will induce the student to go on and read again. That kind of thing is, I think, now neglected. In fact, you can show that in the ordinary schoolroom, everything is on the side of misusing the contingencies of reinforcement the teacher possesses.
Now, to take another departure, let me take the area of defense mechanisms. This seems to be a rather important contribution of Freud, and it seems to have gotten into our society quite heavily. It's used a great deal in even common everyday discourse. And mechanisms like rationalization, projection, identification, and so on. Now, how do you feel about this kind of attempt to understand and explain behavior?
Well, I've analyzed all the Freudian mechanisms in this sense, and I attribute them all to aversive control. They are ways of avoiding undesirable consequences of one sort or another. And when analyzed in that way, they suggest immediately possible corrections. If instead of building up the behaviors you want in people, you punish the behaviors you don't want, the effect, I'm speaking very roughly now, the effect is to allow the individual to discover ways which do indeed avoid the punishing consequences, but they may not be effective ways. We call them neurotic ways. If, however, you build the behavior you want, then you produce the behavior you want. when you simply punish the slothful student for sloth, the ignorant student for his ignorance, the willful student for his willfulness, and so on, you leave it up to the student to figure out ways of escaping. And what he does then is largely a question of accident. On the other hand, if you schedule his behavior, the reinforcement, so that his behavior becomes energetic, very far from slothful, if you schedule, program repertoires of responses which lead him out of his ignorance, and when you give him inducements for behaving in terms of the dictates of society instead of his own selfish interests, you not only have solved the problems of sloth, ignorance, and willfulness, but you have constructed desirable behaviors. And that is the reason why the positive shaping is so much more successful.
The overall problem of now taking a model, such as your model here of positive reinforcement, raises a kind of a broad theoretical issue that I know would be very interesting to hear you react to. It's been an area that's kind of plagued us in psychology in general. It's a question of theory building versus developing a paradigm or a model, and of course you have consistently been described as not necessarily feeling that theories really are too fruitful in this field. How do you feel about this? Do you continue to feel that theories are not the most fruitful approach for psychologists?
Well, this all depends on what you mean by theory. I have been called an anti-theorist, but in the paper where I give that impression, this paper called Our Theories of Learning Necessary, I define very carefully what I mean by theories. I mean explaining behavior in terms of something going on in another universe, such as mental life or the nervous system. And those theories I do not believe are essential, and I don't think they're helpful. I think they're dangerous. They cause all kinds of trouble. But I look forward to an overall theory of human behavior in the sense of a conception of human behavior, which is the bringing together of a lot of different facts and expressing them in more general terms. That kind of theory I not only have openly advocated, but I'm very much interested in promoting. In that sense, I am a theoretician. However, I don't accept the methodologies of science which have been proposed by, let us say, John Dewey in his little book, How We Think, or in the statistical method, which is taught as if it were how scientists think, or in scientific method in general. I think these are very far from reflecting what the scientist really does. I think it's a great mistake to teach the student that he must wait until he has a hypothesis, must deduce a theorem from it, must then design an experiment to test the theorem and to confirm or disprove the hypothesis. That is an a posteriori reconstruction of what happened, perhaps, but it has nothing to do with the actual behavior of the scientist. Fortunately for science, theory and statistics didn't get formulated until about the 19th century, so that a good deal of science got underway before scientists were told what they ought to be doing. And I resist being told, and I don't feel that my own scientific activities are adequately described at all by the logician of science, or the statistician, or the mathematical model builder, anything of that kind.
I see. Now, of course, this raises an awful lot of important questions in the matter of training the student. And I do think that we do continue to train our students along hypothetical deductible lines, certainly, and this seems to be a rather important part of all of our training of psychology students. I suspect then you're really saying that this probably is not even too important then in the training of the student.
I think it's a shame to give psychologists a course in statistics as if that were a course in how to think. It's nothing of the sort. And I, in my own case, I like to get my students in contact with the subject matter, mixing it up with the subject matter as quickly as possible, teaching them how to spot useful lines of investigation, how to discard non-useful. I don't know of any student of mine who has ever designed an experiment in advance. I don't believe in experimental design. This is all right for certain very simple manipulations of multiple variables, as in the case of R.A. Fisher's work. But that's not representative of science in general. And it's a great shame to teach the psychologist he must approach his field in that way. Many of them don't know how to do it. They don't seem to find anything of interest. But if you give a young psychologist some equipment and a behaving organism, let him begin to explore ways of manipulating that behavior, he doesn't need any scientific method. He's in there and discovering things which are quite valuable.
As you look over the very, very intriguing and provocative contributions that you've made over the years, and many of which we've touched on briefly in this very informal discussion, which of these do you yourself consider to be the most vital, the most important, the most crucial?
Well, let me preface that first by saying that I think I've had a lot of very lucky accidents happen to me in my career as a scientist. But as I look back on it, it seems to me that the important thing which has emerged is the use of rate of responding as a basic datum. And of course that is reflected in the so-called cumulative record, and we all use those records, although better ways of analyzing rates are coming along now, better ways of analyzing inter-response times and so on. But a cumulative record makes visible at a glance changes in rate over long periods of time. And that is a kind of analysis of the data which is instantaneous, it's online, it comes right out as the experiment proceeds, and opens up wide vistas of exciting possibilities. I think the use of a cumulative record in making behavioral processes visible is my main contribution as a methodologist. Now, the variables which can be looked at as influencing that rate are important, of course. I started out in the field of motivation, deprivation, satiation, but I quickly went into conditioning and the contingencies and stimulus control and so on, and then, of course, with Forster, these very complicated schedules. Now, this rate, as represented in a cumulative record, is a highly reproducible datum. We never have much trouble. If two people do an experiment the same way and something is wrong in the curve, they don't agree, it's very easy to spot what is wrong. Some little technical problem is the records themselves contain indications of deficiencies in the technique. As time has gone on, these records get smoother and smoother as we gain control of more and more variables. Now, that is the heart of the experimental analysis of behavior, as I use that term. And now, of course, there are hundreds of people engaged in this research. I have no contact with most of them, actually, nor am I responsible for most of them. This happens to be a very useful method, and I don't regard everybody who uses it as my disciple or my achievement at all. I happened to hit on it, and it has worked very well for a large number of us, and is, I think, producing a corpus of data, a body of knowledge, which is expanding very rapidly, which is very substantial. You build on the past. You don't throw the past out, as is in the case of disproving a hypothesis. You just add other details. And the picture which is emerging of behavior as a function of complex contingencies arranged by the everyday environment is a very heartening one. Now, that, so far as the laboratory science goes, is what I feel that I've done. But I have always been interested in extrapolations to other areas. I make a distinction, on the one hand, between prediction and control, which is a laboratory enterprise for the most part, and interpretation, where one simply makes plausible guesses at what variables are probably operating in a given case. And you can interpret verbal behavior, as I did in my book on verbal behavior. You can interpret the contingencies arranged by legal systems, for example, in this way. A law specifies behavior, an act of a person, and it specifies usually a punishment. Namely, it specifies contingencies. And laws are statements of contingencies which are backed up by the political system of a country. Economics is full of tricky schedules of reinforcement, hourly wages, piecework pay, incentive wages, all of which have been beautifully duplicated without intentionally being, we haven't been working to do this, but the analysis of schedules in lower organisms fits perfectly into the analysis of incentive systems in industry. And to some extent, sales, rentals, and so on, these are also complex contingencies. Games are, we're way ahead of the game theory people and do a much better job than they can in investigating the tricky contingencies which arise when people play games. I've analyzed some of the contingencies involved in religious system, different types of religious control. And of course you've mentioned psychotherapy. So these are areas, and there are others, the ethical group, the family structure, and so on. I've been interested recently in what I've been calling just to myself paleo-behavior, speculations that historians and others have made about how human behavior took on the characteristics of civilized man over took millions of years. This is a kind of accidental programming of very subtle contingencies until the behavior becomes established, and then the contingencies are established which generate the behavior quickly in a new arrival in the group. But how man in contact with a primitive environment has slowly been shaped so that he begins to control the use of fire, to plant and harvest, and to domesticate animals, and to build, to make tools, and so on. This is almost entirely guesswork, but it's lots of fun. And it is an instance of interpreting interpreting the effect of the physical environment as a set of contingencies of reinforcement.
Well, now you of course mentioned these things that you feel to be, in your way of thinking, the most important contributions, and certainly this ran throughout our discussion here. I think it might be also equally interesting to hear another side of this. What are your greatest concerns about the way your work has been interpreted or maybe misinterpreted? Are there any particular areas of misinterpretation that have particularly troubled you over the years?
I'm not really concerned. I don't think that's quite the right word. I don't expect very many people to know about this or make use of it until there's been a natural growth. And I wouldn't want this to happen. I just don't believe, for example, that most psychotherapists will ever acquaint themselves with the potentialities of positive reinforcement. And to have them try to apply some general principle in their work wouldn't work at all. It's like having people go out and building bridges in terms of some general principle of stress and strain. You've got to be more technical than that, and there will arise a new species of therapist who understands behavior involved. But it doesn't bother me that there are thousands of clinical psychologists who don't know the first thing about this. That's the way it is. It bothers me a little bit that there are thousands of teachers who don't, because this seems to me more important. I think they will eventually know, and I'm much more interested in promoting this kind of thing in the field of education. I'm not particularly interested in promoting it in political science or economics, but there is a rising interest in it in those fields. I don't have any complaint about the speed with which this has been taken up. It's worked. It's grown in a way which maintains its solidity. It's a very stable, solid kind of thing, and will, I'm sure, eventually prevail as a useful analysis of human behavior as well as animal behavior. Now, I am bothered at times when people charge this kind of an analysis with various ignominious shortcomings, that somehow or other I am reducing the dignity or nobility of man. No analysis changes man. He's what he is. I think this view is an optimistic one. I think man can control his future, even though we assume that he is wholly determined. It does not, because science, supposing science establishes with reasonable plausibility, and of course this can never be proved, but supposing science makes it pretty plausible that human behavior is entirely determined, then you might say, well, why should man do anything? And this is one of those transitional things from one philosophy to another. But even though it is true, if it is true, that man is entirely controlled by his environment, man is always changing the environment. And he builds the world in which his behavior has certain kinds of characteristics. And he does this because the changes are reinforcing to him. And a very important part of that control of the environment seems to me to be concerned with self-control. Man builds a world in which he behaves effectively. He builds a world in which he suffers fewer aversive stimuli. He avoids extremes of temperature, he preserves food so he doesn't go hungry and so on. That's easy to account for. But he also builds a world in which he is more likely to get on with his fellow men, in which he is more likely to educate himself so that he'll be more effective in the future and so on. Over a period of thousands of years, you can see, if you want to argue from history, that there has been an accumulation of behavioral techniques which have improved the effectiveness of human behavior. Man controls himself, but he controls it by controlling his environment. And this is quite possible in a determined system.
Now, one thing I know that you must have felt over your lifetime as a scientist is that perceptions of your work have led to some rather personal indictments of you and your own motives in this whole process, that you are becoming an effective propagandist for a value system that you're trying to impose on society. And I certainly think it might be all quite fair to hear your reaction to this kind of statement.
I know there are people who are disturbed by this kind of analysis, but I have never felt that there was a personal attack on me. I don't regard myself as a propagandist, if by that you mean using anything except perfectly straightforward ways in promoting a subject matter. My papers are very seldom argumentative. I don't debate issues with other people, with the single exception of my friend Carl Rogers, with whom I've had several debates on this whole question of the dignity of man and the whole the control of men. This doesn't particularly bother me that they should be that people should be disturbed, and I'm not out to allay disturbance. Certainly my scientific work has been just a report of facts and a report of what I have found to be effective formulations. More recently, it is true, I have decided to spend a good deal of time in clearing up some of these misunderstandings, bringing some threads together and tying them up. I do feel that there is a misunderstanding. I've already reached the age, if the Lehman curves can be trusted, of which I'm not going to make any more important discoveries as an experimentalist. I'm shifting to an area where the curve survives a little longer, and I am planning to spend a lot of time in reading and discovering what other people have been thinking about these things, and writing more interpretive accounts. But I don't regard this as propaganda. I've never tried to build an empire. I've never set up a center for operant conditioning at Harvard, for example. I'm quite happy about the speed with which this has all moved, and I'm particularly happy when I see that people in this field are very friendly with each other. When we have meetings of operant conditioners, there's never any unfair criticism or bickering or backbiting. Everybody is very helpful. They practice positive reinforcement. And this is a wonderful thing, and it's not that we're a lot of wonderful people. It is that there's plenty here for all. There's nothing to be fought over. If someone else gets on, it doesn't mean that your chances of getting on have been injured at all. So that we're really living in the lap of luxury here. The methods pay off beautifully, and all sorts of things to be discovered, and we're all very friendly and happy with each other, and I don't really care whether other people aren't cutting in on this. If they want to come along, there's more for everyone. They don't need to be sold. It doesn't need any propaganda. All you need to do is to publish the results.
I see. Well, I think that this certainly gives us a very good insight, and some of these questions were pretty rough for you. And I might also say, Dr. Skinner, it's been a real pleasure, personally, for me to be here in your office and workshop, really, in a way, and seeing the kind of environment under which you yourself are positively reinforced. We've had a wonderful opportunity to see what you're like and how you work, and to hear about some of your ideas, and thank you very much.
Thank you.